Darian Fenton.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to take a call in the second reading of the Marine Legislation Bill, and may I share my colleague Chris Ockenville's enthusiasm for this bill. It was indeed extremely interesting, but also, while I have the opportunity, may I welcome Mike Sabin as Deputy Chair to our committee, and he's not listening, but anyway, oh, you are listening? Okay. But may I also point out it's actually the Transport and Industrial Relations Bill, and that's got a lot to do with workers, and I fear that's going to be very challenging for that member when the time comes to consider this government's terrible program that it has for cutting the rights of workers. And also, can I also assure Mr Sabin that he is going to get a ritual beating from me in my speech as well, and because I have been on the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee forever. That's right, and the member's right. I have since 2005, when I came into Parliament with Kate Wilkinson, and actually we were on the Select Committee then together too. So I know quite a lot of the history of the events that led to some of this bill. But also, Mr Speaker, I arrived in Tauranga the day after the Rena hit the astrolabe reef, and before the storm, because there was a big storm, and overnight the sands of Tauranga turned black. And I'll never forget waking up in the morning and looking out my window and seeing all of the beaches surrounding where I was staying black. It was just devastating. And the people of Tauranga were heartbroken. And they were already reeling, as we know, from the impact of the PSA on their kiwi fruit. But what they were looking at was what was happening to their beautiful coastline, the wildlife and their kaimoana. What was wonderful is how they got out and helped where they could. And while it was more than 2 years ago, there are still questions I think that this bill brings up. As I said, I've been a member of the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee since I entered Parliament in 2005. Maurice Williamson was a member from 2005 to 2008. Kate Wilkinson was also a member during that period. Both became ministers in the new government. And David Bennett was also a member, and he's been there forever as well, but he's now chair of the committee. So he can't. But what's interesting is Maurice Williamson and Kate Wilkinson can speak for herself, but I wonder about this. But David Bennett can't even remember that in 2005 to 2008, that committee passed a recommendation that the two conventions that this bill introduces should be passed into legislation so they could be enforced by the New Zealand courts. And those two conventions are the International Treaty on Convention of Limitation of Liability for Marine Claims, which would have doubled the $12 million liability limit in the case of the RENA, and funded compensations for businesses and property that was adversely affected, and the Bunker Convention, the second convention that this bill deals with. The incoming Minister, Stephen Joyce, had a briefing in 2008 which noted that the Ministry was ready to introduce legislation to update the Maritime Transport Act. And guess what? This is now 2013,
That's right.
And we are just on the second reading of this bill. 5 years later, it has taken all this time to hit the House. And meantime, what I saw as I sat on that select committee was Maritime New Zealand being engaged on pointless value for money exercises demanded by this government, when all the time we had an accident of the size of the RENA waiting to happen with dreadful consequences. And in fact, the consequences could be described as the leaky homes crisis of the sea. And it goes back even further than that, Mr Speaker. And I think it goes back to Maurice Williamson's days as the Minister of Transport when he deregulated coastal shipping in New Zealand, where he gutted the regulations required for coastal shipping and ships sailing around our coastline delivering freight, and basically opened up our seaways to the sort of disaster that we ended up seeing with Rena. That's another debate, and I'm sure we'll have that debate at some stage, because certainly Labor's committed to reinstating coastal shipping. Because, you know, I think one of the members before described it as, you know, how important shipping is and how it brings, you know, huge amounts of goods in and it's worth billions of dollars and so on. But what we do instead, of course, of what this government does, of course, is tends to put all of that freight and other things on the roads when we have perfectly great highways of the sea, currently unregulated, that need to be regulated. But there were other things in this bill, and as I mentioned, some of them were very interesting. I am fascinated, and this again goes back to the length of time I've spent on the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee. I am fascinated by the government's keenness to introduce the blood alcohol limit of 0.05 milligrams for seafarers. Yes, we know it's part of a convention that we've signed up for, but this issue of the blood alcohol limit for drivers on New Zealand roads is not new to the Transport and Industrial Relations Committee, and in fact it's had several opportunities to introduce it. When we last considered it, I think it was 2 years ago, and what we were told by the government then is that there was not enough research that was available. Actually, there was mountains of research, but we had to have New Zealand-specific research, so we're still waiting. And I think actually one of the things that our committee should do is ask for an update as to where that research is, because I suspect it may well have been just something, just a means of putting off a difficult issue that this government didn't want to tackle. The interesting parts of this bill, anyone that loves the sea, as we do in New Zealand, is fascinated by ships, would have been fascinated by this bill. There's some really interesting things in it, Mr. Speaker. A whole provision around the removal of wrecks. Now, it never occurred to me that there would be regional council responsibility for removing wrecks, which of course become a hazard in their own right. So there was lengthy discussion about responsibilities and the requirements around that. And of course, they've not only become hazards to other shipping, they've also become environmental hazards. The other recollection I have of this bill is the long discussions we had about harbour masters and the role of harbour masters, who are apparently very, very difficult to find. We have very few trained and qualified harbour masters in New Zealand, and local councils were very concerned about some of the provisions that were being proposed, because they say it's almost impossible to hire trained and qualified harbour masters as required by maritime legislation. When I asked why, they were pretty frank. They said there's no training program going on, and also the salaries are not attractive enough. I think that is something that we will have to address in the future. The other thing that I was fascinated about, was interested in, and there were some good submissions on, were the proposals around the responsibilities of port facilities and ports to ensure health and safety, and the responsibilities that they would be required to carry out. So under the original bill, it said that they had responsibilities to prevent health and safety accidents that could endanger or is unlikely to endanger any person or property on a ship or at sea. Now, the ports were, and we all know ports are a bit of a sensitive topic, still continue to be actually at Auckland Port, still not settled, but what they did note is that the government has this great ministerial task force on health and safety, and they consider that our health and safety levels are below the levels of other countries, and they're absolutely right about that, Mr. Speaker. And the Port CEO Group actually want to see the task force process completed, and they were concerned that there was going to be a mix-up between the Health and Safety and Employment Act and the requirements under this bill in terms of port facility responsibilities. So it was an interesting bill. It's a very long bill, and I also want to endorse what Chris Ockenbill said about the contribution of the officials, their willingness to answer questions and do the research, and their very impressive knowledge of what is clearly a unique part of law in New Zealand that very few people have experience. And so, Mr. Speaker, Labor is supporting this bill. We look forward to the debate in the committee stages, when I'm sure we will get into discussing a lot more detail. Thank you.
Dr Cam Calder.
Mr Speaker, it's a great pleasure to rise and speak on the marine legislation bill. And I must say I enjoyed the contribution from the member who's just sat down, and it betokens the pleasure and enthusiasm I think that members of the committee had in considering this rather arcane but nonetheless interesting piece of work. A lot of work that's been done. It enjoys widespread support across the House, and that in itself is a pleasure.